All right, I'm going to take the JDL here, and I can do Control A, Control C, and we'll come over here to IntelliJ. And obviously I've been running this a couple times to inspect what it's doing, and I think I'm pretty happy with the model that we have now. Have some spacing there. Doesn't change the syntax, but it does change how I look at it. I like to have neat code. And let's come over here. Let's see here. Let me clear that. And here's the command. So I'm going to do a jhipster import JDL, and you can see that I'm in the root of the project. I'm just doing /source main scripts and RFB tables.jh, and that corresponds to this file here in the IDE, so you can see the project structure. And I will add a reference to this inside of GitHub for you to the course resources. So what I want to do is go ahead and import this. And comes up, do we want to overwrite it? Yes. That's one of the things I like about working with JDL. And I'm going to say, yeah, do everything. And it's going to take a second to run. And what it's going through is it's going in and it's going to build up all the JPA entities. It's building up the service classes. It's building up the interfaces. It's building up the mappings, the DTOs, etc. So it's going to build the whole thing for us. And we see that the build did complete. Now let's come over to IntelliJ. And what I want to do is inspect the domain model. And if you remember, let's come back over here. So we have RFB location. So that's kind of like at the top of everything. So let's take a look at that first. Now you can see this is the entity that was generated. You notice that it did not specify an ID value, but we did get one generated. So that is a feature of JHipster. And location name, run day awake, that looks good. Looking at the JPA mapping here, so we have one to many to RFB events, exactly what we want. So we'll be creating those events through a scheduled job, and I'll show you how to implement that in a future video. So this all looks good for me. So it generated all the getters and setters. It created an equals code, a hash code for us, 2 strings. So all generated by JHipster. So that all looks good. Next thing is let's take a look at the RFB event. And let's just double check. This should not have a reference to RFB user. So that is good. We did not create a bidirectional relationship to user. We definitely did not want that. So let's take a look at an RFB event. So now this has a bidirectional relationship to location, which is good. We may want to transverse the object graph backwards. So good on that. And then we get a set of RFB event attendance records. So that's our one to many there. So this mapping all looks good. We have our event date, event code. And then let's come back over here. Next thing we want to look at is RFB attendance, or event attendance. So we have the date. So we have a reference back to the original event. And then we have a one-to-one relationship with RFB user, which is exactly what we want. Now, I'm probably going to refactor this user. So we'll probably drop this entity and go to user, but I'll do that in a future video. I'm focused on our initial data model here. And then finally, we have our RFB user. So let's take a look at him real quick. So we have our username, and then here's that home location property. So that is exactly what we want. Now let's take a look at this in the console. So I'm going to bring up Spring Boot right now. We'll start him up. And once that gets up and running, let's take a look at the H2 database console. Almost there. Okay, we are up and running. You can see that we're on localhost 8080. And let's come over to Chrome. And I have the H2 database console up. Let's do a quick refresh on that. Now, one thing that I want to note here, this is kind of interesting. I have not seen this before, but this really trips people up when working with the database console. This URL, you need to set that properly, and JHipster is setting it to a different value. So it came right up to RFB loyalty for me and a username of RFB loyalty. So I thought that it was interesting. So this is getting configured at runtime. I don't know if it's something that JHipster is doing or a recent change to Spring Boot to where they're setting it. So there are ways to set the defaults in this on initialization, but previously it was kind of to whatever the browser had set up. And if you have something different here and you put in like whatever. When you connect to that, it kind of takes anything and you connect to an empty database and you're like, where's my tables? This trips up a lot of people because they don't realize that connect string is very important and you're connecting to an in-memory database. And if it's different than what you're running, so you're going to connect to a brand new database while Spring Boot is on a different one. You're like, where's my tables? Well, the root cause of the problem is you're in the wrong database. So let's take a quick look at this. Connect. So we can see here's all the JHipster tables. Now let's take a look at RFB location. That's at the top of our schema. So we have an ID, location name, run day a week. That all looks good. Then let's take a look at the event. So we have event date and code, location ID. So that all looks good. And we can see we even have foreign key constraints there. So that's all generated by JHipster and Hibernate. Let's take a look at the attendance date. We have a reference back to event ID and then a reference to user ID. So that all looks good. Now we have our user ID, username, and home location ID. So that all looks good. So the data model, I'm pretty happy with the data model. That all looks really good to me. So coming up, what we'll do is we'll add in a bootstrap class to initialize data in the database for us to work with that. When I'm writing an application like that, that's like always one of my first things to do. So I've got the data model here, and what I want to do is create a bootstrap class to load data, and it gives me two things. One is to set up data for me to work with, and two, to validate my data model. So once I start writing code against it to populate it, I'll be like, oh, maybe this isn't working out and I want to change something. So very good to do that first initial step. So create your data model and then actually work with the data model and see if it does in fact fit your needs, because it's not uncommon where you're going to have to go back and refactor something. Okay, I wanted to add in a little piece here. If you remember when I went over to the console, I'll like log out here. So remember I said this was defaulting here, and what I realized as I was going in to commit things, I saw this file that I did not see before. So this is something that the JHipster team is doing, and it's actually built in. So in resources, we have the .h2.server properties. Now I knew you could set up for the console using this from your home directory, but this is actually being loaded in. So this is a nice little touch. So something that I learned from the JHipster team here. So in resources, they're doing this hidden file of .h2.server.properties, and that's what's setting up this in-memory database for us. So you can see that it's setting up all this stuff here, and this is how that got defaulted. So again, if you're not working with JHipster, this is something that would not be getting set. So that does trip up a lot of my students going through my Spring 5 course, because that does not get set and it comes up to a default. It seems like the application does store it as a cookie or something. So once you set it, it does remember it, but it does, for people just starting with Spring Boot, that is something that quite commonly trips them up. So I wanted to show you that interesting little feature. I will probably be stealing that. That's a pretty cool little feature that they set up here. So learned something from the JHipster team here today, and I wanted to share it with you.